So once again, we've got Matthew with this stuff about being cast into the outer darkness and the wailing and gnashing of teeth. What is this obsession with the gnashing of teeth? I don't even really know exactly what gnashing of teeth means, but it sounds really awful. I mean, in tradition, St. Luke, the Gospel of St. Luke, Luke is known as the physician. Maybe we ought to call Matthew the orthodontist, because he seems to have this obsession with gnashing teeth. Okay, but seriously, folks, as we come closer to the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is challenging the authorities more directly. And as we get closer to the end of Matthew's Gospel, the stakes of Jesus' teaching get higher and higher and tenser and tenser. And as Jesus moves closer and closer to his own death, knowing he's moving closer to his death, the parables he tells get darker and more apocalyptic. The parables get stranger and more troubling. Oh, there's certainly plenty to trouble us in this parable, maybe not least of which is, for me, the fact that this particular parable is very often used as sort of an undergirding for something known as the prosperity gospel, the idea that if you do what God wants you to, God will make you rich. Well, let's set that aside for a moment. That's another sermon. But there is plenty of other things in this parable to trouble us, even if we don't look at that. First of all, there's the same question we had to deal with in the last several weeks in the parable of the tenants in the vineyard and the parable of the king's wedding feast. This question of, are we supposed to see the master in this parable as God? I mean, on the one hand, the master entrusts his servants with great wealth, the same way that God entrusts us with all of creation. So on the one hand, it seems a pretty good bet that the master is supposed to be God. But on the other hand, the master is this rich financier, possibly even corrupt, if we're to believe the third slave who says he's a man who reaps where he did not sow and gathers where he did not cast seed. That sounds a little shady. At the very least, he advises his slaves to loan money at interest, which is against the Torah. So this guy, we start to wonder, are we really supposed to think of him as God? And at any rate, he seems, or at least the third slave sees him as harsh and greedy. So we have to wonder, are we supposed to fear the master the same way the third slave fears the master? Or is that just the way the third slave sees the master? And what about the master's reaction to the third slave, when he says, take away the money from the poor man, the one who had little, and give it to the one who has a lot? Is that really what we're expecting God to say? Punishing the poor slave for being afraid of him? Okay, remember what we've said about parables before. Parables are very seldom straightforward allegories where we can map one character in the parable onto a character into the real world. If we try to do that, we almost always get into trouble. Maybe the most we can say, at least in this case, is the situation in the parable, the whole dynamic in the parable, is meant to tell us something about our situation and our dynamic. The relationship between the slaves and the master and the money tells us a little bit about our relationship between ourselves and God and the gifts and the wealth that we have. We have to remember that any time we talk about God, we're only talking in approximations. Anytime we talk about God, we're leaving more unsaid than we actually say. So let's just hold this lightly. Let's just sort of agree that the master isn't exactly God. But the story of the master can tell us something about our relationship with God. We have to kind of keep this metaphorical and light. But there's another troubling thing in this parable that kind of gets lost in the translation because we don't know about the amount of money that's being talked about when it says a talent. We've talked before about the fact that a denarius is the daily wage of a worker. Sort of a minimum wage worker would get 1 denarius a day for laboring all day. Well, a talent is equivalent to 6,000 denarii. So that means a talent would be approximately 20 years' wages for a worker. If you look at the minimum wage, a minimum wage worker in the United States, 1 talent would be equivalent to about $350,000. as much as that person would make in 20 years. If you look at the median wage for an American worker, a talent would be about $1 million. And we're talking about 2 talents and 5 talents. We're talking about huge sums of money. However we look at it, this master is leaving slaves in charge of 1 talent or 2 talent or 5 talents. He's leaving them with this huge sum of money, way more than they could ever need, way more than they could ever make. So Jesus, by making these huge numbers, he's really trying to get our attention here. He's trying to say, this isn't something trivial. This is important. This is a big deal. So we've got this uncomfortable story about a master who may or may not be a shady businessman and may or may not represent God. And he leaves something between $3 million and $8 million with his servants and goes away, and 2 of the servants double their money by trading with it, by speculating with it, and the 3rd servant returns it untouched. So what's really going on here? What's the real situation here? Well, I have a problem in this parable with the word trustworthy. When the master comes back and praises the first 2 slaves for being trustworthy. When I think of investing my retirement money, when I think of investing it's not talents of money, I'll tell you, it's denarii of money. But when I think of investing mine, I want somebody trustworthy handling it, right? I want someone who is aware that she's gambling with my money, not hers. And is aware, I want somebody who is not going to be taking risks that I wouldn't take. I don't want anything too risky. I want her to be trustworthy. Well, we don't know exactly how long the master was gone. It says a long time. We don't know how long he was gone. But you don't double $5 million. The first 2 slaves did not double their money without taking some risks. You don't double your money by putting it in an FDIC-insured certificate of deposit. We all know that. You don't double your money by putting it into a well-balanced fund of equities and debts. I mean, you double your money by taking big risks. To double $5 million, you play big, you win big, and maybe you lose big. That's what risk is. There's a real risk you can lose it all, and there's a real risk you're going to lose this money which doesn't even belong to you. And these are the slaves that the master calls good and trustworthy. These are the slaves who have gone out and speculated and taken risks with this money they've been left. They're the good and trustworthy slaves. Well, wait a minute. Isn't that exactly the strategy that got our economy in the dumper a couple years ago? People taking somebody else's money and going out and taking huge risks with it and then losing it? Isn't that exactly what got us into this situation? When I hear somebody talking about taking huge risks with somebody else's huge sums of money, good and trustworthy are not the first words that come to my mind, at least not right now. I mean, especially after the last couple of years, the idea of burying the money in the backyard doesn't sound that crazy. If I'd buried the money in the backyard, I might have been better off. Prudence and security sound a lot more good and trustworthy right now, right? We're all looking for something safe, something secure. Safety and security. What do we know about security? What did we hear in this morning's reading about security? Well, in today's reading from the first letter to the Thessalonians, Paul warns, when they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. When they say peace and security, that's when destruction is going to come. Security is an illusion. Security is an idol. Security is a false idol. Security is that lie that tells us we are in charge and in control of our own destiny. Security is that lie that tells us all we have to do is hunker down and hold on and not take any risks and we'll be fine. Security is that lie that tells us to bury the treasure in the backyard because at least we won't lose it. Security is the idol that tells us, well, if we don't play, at least we won't lose anything. If we don't invest, at least we won't fail. If we don't take any risks, nothing bad can happen. Because security is built on fear. Security is built on that fear that failing is the worst possible thing that can happen to us. Well, now, let me play a little what-if game here. It's dangerous to play what-if with Scripture. Do not try this at home. But imagine for a moment what might have happened in this parable if one of the three slaves who had been trading with his money had lost it all. What would the master's reaction have been if he came back and found out that one of these slaves had taken a big risk and it didn't pay off? Would he have been as harsh as the third slave thought he was going to be? The third slave said, well, I know you're a harsh man who reaps where you didn't sow and gathers where you didn't scatter, and so I was afraid to take any risk. Would the master really have punished someone for taking a risk when he's punishing someone for not taking a risk? I mean, would the master have been so unreasonable as to expect us to take a risk with the treasure and then punish us if the risks don't pan out? I mean, what kind of risk is that? What kind of master is that? And as long as we're playing what if, what really would have happened to that treasure if the slave had lost it all in the market? I mean, remember, this isn't paper wealth. This isn't the kind of wealth that's in the stock market and disappears if something funky happens in the Greek economy. This is real wealth. This is silver. This is a big hunk of money that people have actually worked for, and it's something of value that actually exists. This is real treasure. So if the slave had lost it, it's not like that treasure evaporates. It would just belong to somebody else. Like it went away, it would just have been given away. And that's where I come back to this outrageous, over-the-top amount of the treasure left to the slave. These millions of dollars, far more than they needed to live on, far more than they ever could have made on their own, more than they can enjoy on their own. This is a story about abundance, about over-the-top abundance, about more than we ever need. And the third slave, in this story of abundance, the third slave reacts from scarcity, reacts from fear. This is a story where there's more than enough treasure for everybody. Millions of dollars. There's no reason to hold. This is a story where there's no reason to be afraid that there's not going to be enough. This is a story where there's no reason not to take a risk. The only way the treasure can be lost in this story is if somebody deliberately buries it in the backyard, if somebody deliberately takes it out of circulation so that nobody can enjoy it. The only way this treasure can be lost is if somebody deliberately chooses security over risk. God has given a lot into our care. God has given us a lot of treasure. And this time of year, we tend to be a little bit more conscious of everything God has given us. We tend to be conscious of giving thanks for everything God has provided us. This time of year, we like to count our blessings. We like to tally up all the abundance that God allows us to enjoy and give thanks for it. And the thing we learn, one way or another, God provides. God gives us enough. He gives us what we need. But of all the treasure that God puts in our hands, of all the treasure that God leaves in our care, there is one that is more outrageous, more staggering than any millions we could make in the stock market. There is, of all the things that God gives us, there is one treasure that should really get our attention, really shock us. A treasure that's more than we could earn in 100 years. Of all the treasure that God gives us, the greatest treasure is the good news. The good news of Jesus Christ. The greatest treasure is the good news that God risked it all by becoming human. God risked it all to reconcile humanity to God. God risked it all even to the point of dying on the cross. And the really good news is that God risked it all and rose triumphant from the grave, that God risked it all And we are the ones that stand to collect the payoff of that big, big risk. God has given us this good news. God has given us this treasure. And God does not expect us to bury it in the backyard. God does not expect us to keep it safe. God expects us to risk it all. God expects us to go all in with this treasure. God expects us to spread it around, to let some of it go. God expects us to be trustworthy. God expects us to be worthy of God's trust. And what God trusts us to do with this treasure is to give it away. Amen.